So Congress is returning to Washington after the August recess, and Democrats in the House Judiciary Committee are expected to vote on expanding their impeachment inquiry into President Trump. The formal inquiry will reportedly include the president's possible role in hush money payments to women he allegedly had affairs with. The president denies those allegations, of course, and Democrats want to look into reports that he offered pardons to officials willing to break the law over immigration policies. Kim Wehle is a CBS News legal analyst, and she joins us now from Washington. Let us talk, Kim. Impeachment is something that Democrats have sort of tossed about for quite a bit now. How significant is this vote to define an inquiry?
It's the Democrats have to really think about whether they're going to carry the ball all the way or not. This sort of seems like a half measure. That is, there's been talk that impeachment is happening, or the threshold sort of committee hearings maybe are going on, but they haven't formally announced that process. There have been a lot of witnesses that haven't been called. Of course, the Attorney General is refusing to respond to subpoenas relating to the underlying documentation in the Mueller report. So we're going to have to see the courts get involved here if the impeachment process is going to move forward, and that might take something more formal, because the argument with respect to subpoenas in part can be like, well, with respect to regular legislation and oversight, you don't get it, but the Democrats could say if it's a real impeachment inquiry, the courts are more likely to give them the information and the witnesses they want. But to sort of kind of half walk the impeachment sort of lamely and then not actually hold hearings and make a vote on actual articles of impeachment, I think that's problematic, potentially politically, but also just for the rule of law and the notion of impeachment itself.
So then there's a vote. It's successful, let's say. What actually happens afterwards?
So it looks like what they're talking about now is giving themselves additional authority to actually ask questions of witnesses. So a more expansive oversight than we would normally see for a non-impeachment process. If the Democrats or the House, which it looks like more than half the Democrats are now supporting impeachment, if they were actually to agree on articles of impeachment, that functions essentially like an indictment. An indictment, of course, is in the criminal justice process in a court, but for purposes of presidents and other actually actors in the federal government, impeachment means indictments in the House of Representatives, and then that would go to the Senate for trial. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court would oversee that trial, and the jury, so to speak, the Senate would have to convict by 2/3. And Nancy Pelosi knows, in this moment, the Republicans are not going to do that. So the issue is, if they move forward on impeachment, is it going to sort of fall so flat that it will hurt her people within her caucus that are in Trump-heavy states, that they could be fragile in terms of the next election, in addition to sort of opening up a can of worms for 2020. Many people believe that, notwithstanding impeachment, if Trump is going to be held accountable, it has to be at the polls in 2020. And so she has a very difficult decision to make in terms of responding to her caucus and people within the Democratic Party, voters who want to see accountability for this president on the one hand, and understanding that to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and turn the election in Trump's favor is really risky business. It's impossible for her to be able to foresee how that's going to shake out. Her delegates or her caucus is just going to have to do the best they can.
Mm-hmm. So Congress is going to be facing a number of issues, but I'm just going to ask you about one: gun control. We've had these mass shootings while they were off. There is an increased demand for something to be done. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer asking the president to be urgent and move forward. Mitch McConnell indicated that he's waiting for the White House to give some sort of guidance. Realistically, though, what are the options for Congress, and could anything the Democrats push for face a legal challenge anyway?
Well, this Mitch McConnell's relationship with the president is really the problem, because the president is so mercurial. So he's basically saying, I want a commitment from the president that he'll sign a bill into law if I take it to the Senate floor. And the president has waffled on this issue like he's waffled on many issues. He's not someone that can be taken at his word certainly in these hot button issues. So it's really unlikely, if that's the metric for actually passing legislation, we're going to see anything. anything. That being said, the House has passed legislation since February to at least authorize background checks, and there's over 90% public support for background checks. So what we're seeing here is a broken Congress, so to speak. If 90% of the public wants legislation, and the members of Congress are there to represent individual voters, to represent we the people, their constituencies, and they're not doing anything, and this is really falls at the feet of Mitch McConnell in the Senate. If they're not doing anything, we have to ask ourselves what's wrong with the Congress. If they're not answering to who their bosses should be, individual voters, who are they actually answering to? Now, with respect to the Second Amendment, the Supreme Court, this is a bit of a myth. I've written about this. The Supreme Court has said that people have a right to handgun ownership in the home for self-defense. Not any gun, not any weapon, not walking around in Walmarts, not weapons of sort of mass destruction that were created on the battlefield to basically inflict as much harm as possible. So I don't think, even with a conservative court, that the court is going to give a green light to any kind of arms, plutonium in someone's garage, for example, or other kinds of weapons, chemical warfare, for example. There's always going to be a balance. And so I don't think going to the courts to get a broader net to protect gun rights is necessarily going to work out for the gun lobby. They're better off keeping this it's kind of hung up in the Senate so that this never really makes it to the court because there's not a ripe case to challenge.
Hey, so listen, very quickly before we let you go, I want to talk about this op-ed that you wrote for The Hill. You mentioned that Democrats are looking into the idea that the reports out there that perhaps pardons were offered to officials who were willing to break the law in order to enforce this immigration policy, the president's immigration policy. You're writing about pardons. Tell us why they are important and the impact that they are having on Congress today.
You know, this is really serious business, and it's one of many things that I think don't get the kind of press that it should get because there's so many sort of egregious assaults really on the rule of law and the Constitution going on there. And I say that really apolitically. If we have a president or anyone in office who is using his or her authority to basically enhance his own political objectives, that's really a problem. So in this moment, the pardon is there as a matter historically. It has it's grounded in common law England with, you know, the monarch's power that traces to God, essentially. The idea is the monarch can be generous and kind to people originally that were convicted of a crime and sentenced to death. The king could say, I give you mercy, and you don't have to go to the gallows. So people perceive that as somehow giving the president a blank check to potentially commit crimes, to encourage people to commit crimes, and then later say, I'm going to take you out of the criminal justice system. I'm going to forgive you. That's a problem because that just does away with the rule of law. And I say in the op-ed, this kind of thing cannot be tolerated under the Constitution. The Constitution is there to ensure that nobody in government has too much power, that no one can use it arbitrarily for their own self-interest. That's what the framers of the Constitution understood, that people's nature is to aggrandize and entrench power. And so we have to keep very careful check on this. So the Congress coming in has three basic jobs in the next month. One is to pass a budget, basically fund the United States government. That has to be done by September 30th. There's a lot of shenanigans that can happen in that regard. Two is to pass substantive legislation, including gun control, which most Americans want. We talked about the problems with that. And number three is oversight of the sort of problems, the red lines that this presidency has crossed. Because if we enlarge the powers of the presidency, that much power goes to the next president. And even if people support this president, they might not support the next president. They have to be careful about giving a lot of king-like, monarch-like powers to that office.
Yeah, great thing to point out. I will check out the op-ed. Kim, thank you very much.
Thanks, Anne Marie.
We're going to take